Sometimes the most remarkable solutions are the ones we've barely even heard of. We've been deep in the research lately, and we've uncovered this really fascinating story about a crop in Ethiopia. It's called Enset.
Right, Enset.
And here's a bit of a mind blower. It's the main food source for, 20 million people?
20 billion, yeah.
But while it looks just like a banana plant, it doesn't produce any edible fruit as we'd think of it.
No, exactly. Which is pretty surprising when you first hear it.
Just let that sink in for a moment.
And what's really fascinating here, I think, is how this seemingly unusual plant, this tree against hunger, as they call it,
Yeah.
it offers such powerful insight into climate resilience and, food security. We've looked at a whole bunch of sources.
What kind of stuff?
Well, detailed research papers, reports from places like Kew Gardens, academic reviews,
Right.
and they're all basically pointing to the same core message. Enset represents this really ingenious adaptation.
Exactly. And that's what we really wanted to dig into for you today. We know you're probably trying to get a handle on a lot of information quickly.
Always feels like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, so this deep dive is about pulling out the essential knowledge. Our mission is pretty straightforward, really, to understand the critical role Enset plays in helping Ethiopia adapt to climate change and maybe even, mitigate its effects.
Right.
We want to show you exactly why this crop is so vital and what makes it so incredibly resilient.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, you'll see that, okay, our focus is this one plant in Ethiopia.
Sure.
But it's such a compelling case study. It really highlights how these localized, sometimes underappreciated resources can offer really effective solutions to these huge global challenges like climate change and food security.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. What exactly is Enset? For someone who's never heard of it, what are we actually talking about here?
Okay, so botanically speaking, Enset ventricosum is a perennial herbaceous plant. It's also monocarpic.
Perennial means it lives for years, right? Monocarpic.
Monocarpic means the main plant flowers and sets seed only once before it dies. But crucially, new shoots keep growing from the base, so the plant line continues.
Ah.
It's related to bananas and plantains, which you can kind of see visually. It mainly grows in the Ethiopian highlands.
What sort of altitude are we talking?
Generally between about 1,200 and 300 and 100 meters.
Yeah.
And visually, it's quite impressive. It has this large pseudostem.
Which is like a false trunk made of leaves.
Exactly. Tightly rolled leaf sheaths. And these enormous leaves, they can sometimes reach up to 10 meters long.
10 meters. Wow. That's genuinely huge. So, okay, if it doesn't have the kind of fruit we'd recognize, what parts do people actually eat?
Right. Good question. The main edible parts are the underground corm. Think of it like a big bulb or tuber.
Okay.
And the pseudostem itself, plus the leaf sheaths. These are processed in different ways to make staple foods.
Like what?
Well, there's kocho, which is a fermented, starchy kind of bread or porridge base. There's wola, which is a higher quality starch powder extracted from the plant liquid.
Okay.
And amicho, which is basically just the corm, boiled. And a really key point is that it can be harvested pretty much year-round.
Year-round. That sounds incredibly valuable for, a stable food supply.
It is, very.
But it must be more than just calories, right? Especially being so central to so many people. You mentioned cultural significance.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Enset is deeply, deeply embedded in the culture of many communities, especially groups like the Waleda in southern Ethiopia.
How so?
Well, historically, it's been absolutely critical for their food security.
Yeah.
I mean, the starkest example is probably the Ethiopian famine in the 1980s.
Right, that was devastating.
It was. But areas that relied heavily on Enset, they were largely food secure. It really showed its life-saving resilience.
Wow. That contrast really drives home how vital it is.
Definitely. And today, it supports over 4 million people just in southern Ethiopia. There are all these intricate cultural practices around how you grow it, harvest it, prepare it. It's woven right into their social fabric, their traditions.
So, culturally indispensable, a reliable food source. What about the nutrition side? I mean, can it really sustain millions?
Nutritionally, it's very rich in carbohydrates, and it provides important minerals too. The main thing it lacks is significant protein.
Ah, okay, so diets need something else.
Yeah, Enset-based diets usually need complementing with protein sources, often livestock products, legumes, things like that.
Makes sense. And economically, is it important for farmers?
Hugely significant. It often gives a higher yield per hectare than cereals like maize or wheat, which is crucial for smallholder farmers who don't have much land.
Higher yield on less land, that's big.
It is. And the fact that you can harvest the corm at different stages means it acts like a kind of living food reserve,
Mm.
a food bank right there in the field.
A field bank, I like that.
Plus, there's high genetic diversity within Enset, so different varieties are adapted to specific local conditions. And selling the processed products, like kocho, in local markets provides income too.
So more productive, acts like a pantry you can access anytime. How does it stack up against the big staples we know, like maize or wheat, in terms of what it can do?
That's a really key comparison. Enset thrives in a wider range of climates, especially in those highland areas where maize or wheat might struggle.
Right.
And its perennial nature living for, say, 4 to 7 years, sometimes even over a decade.
Wow.
That means continuous access to food. You don't have that annual planting and harvesting cycle risk you get with cereals.
Less dependence on seasonal rains, maybe.
Exactly. And crucially, it's proving to be much more resilient in times of drought and other environmental stresses.
How so?
Well, first is when a drought hits, maize yields can just collapse. But Enset, its deep roots can find water, and that pseudostem stores moisture, so it weathers these dry periods much, much better.
Okay, yeah, I'm really starting to see why it gets called the tree against hunger.
Mm-hmm.
So let's really dive into that now. How does Enset work as this climate change adaptation powerhouse?
Well, one of its most remarkable features is just its exceptional drought tolerance and water efficiency.
Okay.
These physiological tricks, basically. Storing water in the pseudostem is a big one. It lets the plant survive long dry spells. It would just kill annual crops.
And the roots?
Yeah, the extensive root system is vital too. It can tap into moisture deeper down in the soil profile.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that research shows farmers in Ethiopia aren't just passively benefiting. Their indigenous knowledge actually leads them to increase Enset planting after droughts.
Yeah.
They know it's the reliable option.
That's fascinating. So they're actively using it as a kind of natural insurance against climate swings.
You could definitely see it that way, yes.
And the fact it's perennial lives for years, that must be a huge factor in adaptation too, right?
Precisely. Not having to replant every single year drastically cuts down on labor, but also on the risks tied to unpredictable weather at planting time.
Yeah, makes sense.
And that year-round harvesting we mentioned,
Mm.
that's critical for providing food during the hunger months, when stores of other foods might run low.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, those processed products, especially kocho, it can be stored for a really long time, sometimes years.
Years.
Yeah. So it acts as a long-term food reserve, a real buffer against climate shocks causing food shortages. The 1980s famine example just perfectly illustrates that power.
It really is like a living, long-lasting pantry. Amazing. What about its other uses? You said it was multi-purpose. How does that link to resilience?
Well, the fact that you can use almost every bit of the plant adds another layer of security.
How so?
Beyond the main food uses, the leaves and pseudo-2 residues are used for animal feed, fibers for rope and construction, parts are used in traditional medicine. It has cultural roles.
So lots of different benefits.
Exactly. It diversifies what households can get from one resource. If climate affects one use, maybe others are still okay. And it generally needs very few external inputs, like fertilizer or pesticides. Right. Minimal need for fertilizers, pesticides, even irrigation once it's established. That makes it accessible for smallholders and less vulnerable if supply chains for those inputs get disrupted.
Okay.
And traditional practices often involve recycling organic matter back onto the Enset plots, which boosts sustainability too.
So it's low maintenance, high utility, acts as this food and resource safety net.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned it's often part of bigger farming systems.
Yes, particularly in southern Ethiopia, you often see Enset as a key part of these quite complex agroforestry systems.
What does that look like?
It means it's grown alongside annual crops, maybe coffee, with livestock integrated, various trees. It creates this diverse, interconnected system.
And that helps resilience.
Absolutely. Diversity fosters synergistic resilience. The Enset plants themselves can even help moderate the local microclimate, providing shade, maybe buffering other more sensitive crops from temperature extremes or water stress.
So it's not just surviving in the environment, it's kind of actively helping to stabilize it for other plants too.
In a way, yes.
And what about the soil itself? Does Enset impact the soil?
Oh, definitely. That massive root system we talked about, it's like a net holding the soil together.
Preventing erosion.
Exactly. Really effective at preventing soil erosion, especially on the hilly terrain common in Ethiopia. This is vital for maintaining soil health, particularly where land is stressed by farming and climate extremes.
Okay, so it's not just adapting to climate change. It sounds like Enset might actually help mitigate it too.
Precisely. That's the other side of the coin. Enset has significant potential for climate change mitigation.
How does that work?
Well, think about it. As this big perennial plant, it builds up a lot of biomass, that huge pseudostem, all those roots.
Right.
Over its long lifespan, it sequesters a considerable amount of carbon, both in the plant tissues and, importantly, in the soil around it.
Storing carbon from the atmosphere.
Yes, and those agroforestry systems we mentioned. Having Enset integrated tends to enhance this carbon sequestration even further.
Is there data on this?
Yeah. Studies have shown significantly higher soil organic carbon levels under Enset compared to land used for annual crops like maize.
How much higher?
The numbers vary, but some research shows increases from, say, 38% up to over 125% more carbon in the soil. One specific study measured about 127 tons of carbon per hectare in Enset fields versus maybe 77 tons in nearby cereal fields.
Wow, that's a really substantial difference.
It's a very big difference, yeah.
So just by growing Enset, farmers are essentially helping draw down CO2 and lock it away underground.
That's a key part of it, yes. And the benefits go beyond just that direct sequestration.
Oh.
Because Enset is perennial and the farming practices usually involve less soil disturbance than annual cropping.
Less plowing, you mean?
Right. Less plowing means the soil structure stays more intact. That stored carbon isn't released as CO2 as readily. So you get reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the farming practice itself.
Okay.
Plus, the traditional reliance on manure and organic matter instead of synthetic fertilizers, that helps cut down on nitrous oxide emissions, which is another powerful greenhouse gas.
It sounds like this whole interconnected system all working in a positive direction.
It really does function that way.
The plant stores carbon, the farming methods release less. And we talked about soil erosion earlier. Does that tie into mitigation too?
Absolutely. By keeping the ground covered with its big leaves and binding the soil with those roots, Enset massively reduces erosion by wind and rain.
And that helps climate mitigation how?
Because soil erosion itself and land degradation in general can release significant amounts of stored carbon back into the atmosphere. So, by preventing erosion and keeping soil healthy, Enset helps keep that carbon locked up in the ground.
Makes sense. And finally, you mentioned it might even reduce pressure on forests. That sounds like a really important side benefit.
It is, potentially, because Enset can be so productive per unit of land, especially where it's managed intensively.
Right, the high yield you mentioned.
It can potentially reduce the need for communities to clear forests, to create new farmland for other less productive crops.
Okay.
And because it's so versatile food, feed, fiber, it might lessen the need to extract those resources from natural ecosystems too.
All right.
So potentially less pressure on forests overall.
This is painting a really, really powerful picture of Enset. But what's the science like underneath it all? How does growing Enset actually lead to these big improvements in soil health?
Yeah, good question. It comes down to several linked factors. A huge one is just the sheer amount of organic matter it contributes.
It's on the plant itself.
Right. All those big leaves, the pseudostem residues, after processing bits of the corm left behind. They get incorporated back into the soil. Then you've got that massive root system constantly growing, dying back, releasing organic compounds. That adds more.
Okay.
And on top of that, you have the traditional management adding manure, household waste. It all feeds the soil organic matter.
Right. I remember you mentioned a study about that. How much goes back in?
Yeah, one study suggested that in some traditional systems, farmers might put something like 80% of the farm's organic waste back onto their fields, with a huge chunk of that, maybe 65%, going specifically to the Enset plots near their homes.
Wow, 80% of organic resources. That's a massive commitment. It really shows they understand soil health is key.
Absolutely, it's deep knowledge.
So what does all that extra organic matter do to the soil structure?
It makes a huge difference. Research shows Enset cultivation leads to lower soil bulk density, meaning the soil is less compacted, more porous, fluffier if you like.
Okay.
It also improves soil aggregation.
Yeah.
The soil particles clump together better into stable little clusters. That's really important for good structure.
And that helps with water.
Yes. More organic matter and better structure mean the soil holds more water, like a sponge. It also improves aeration air getting into the soil and makes it easier for water to soak in and for roots to penetrate.
So the soil becomes healthier, holds more water, lets roots breathe. What about nutrients? Does Enset farming affect soil nutrients?
Yes, it generally leads to more efficient nutrient cycling. Being perennial with that dense leaf canopy helps reduce nutrient loss from runoff or leaching.
Okay.
And the healthier soil, with more organic matter and better structure, supports more soil microbes, earthworms.
Right.
and they're crucial for breaking down organic matter and making nutrients available to plants. Plus, those deep Enset roots might be pulling up nutrients from lower down that shallower-rooted crops can't reach.
So it's like mining nutrients from deep down.
Potentially,
Oh.
yes, bringing them back into the cycle near the surface. Studies consistently find higher levels of key nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in Enset soils compared to adjacent fields growing annual crops.
What about overall fertility? Is there a measure for that?
Yeah, things like cation exchange capacity, or CEC, which is basically a measure of the soil's ability to hold on to essential nutrients. That's often significantly higher in Enset fields. One study reported it being 27% to 57% higher than nearby croplands.
It really sounds like Enset farming just naturally embodies a lot of sustainable soil management principles,
Right?
and it seems totally rooted in generations of traditional knowledge.
It absolutely is.
Oh.
The way farmers carefully manage and apply that organic matter, manure, compost, plant residues, it shows this deep, practical understanding of soil fertility built up over centuries. And the fact that Enset cultivation typically involves minimal soil disturbance, minimal tillage, compared to constant plowing for annual crops. It's a huge for preserving soil structure and organic matter.
Right.
Plus, the common practice of growing it near the homestead makes that intensive management, that feeding of the soil, much more feasible. It's all tightly integrated.
It's really quite remarkable how much ecological wisdom is just built into these farming systems.
It really is.
But, okay, given all these incredible benefits, it can't be perfect. Are there drawbacks, challenges with Enset, and what does the future look like for it?
Yeah, no silver bullets, right? There are definitely challenges. A major one is vulnerability to pests and diseases. Bacterial wilt, in particular, could be really devastating.
Ah, that could wipe out crops.
It can cause significant losses, yes. And that requires good management strategies, especially if you're thinking about expanding Enset into new areas where the disease might not be established yet or where resistance isn't built up.
Okay, what else?
There can also be sort of knowledge gaps and cultural barriers if you try to introduce it where it's not traditionally grown.
How so?
Well, farmers might not have the know-how for cultivating it properly or for the sometimes complex processing methods, and consumers might just not be familiar with kocho or bulla as foods.
Right, acceptance takes time.
Exactly. And compared to global giants like wheat or rice, Enset has honestly received pretty limited scientific research funding and attention.
So we don't know as much.
We know a lot from traditional practice, but there are gaps regarding things like breeding improved varieties, maybe higher yielding or more disease-resistant ones, or developing more efficient processing tech, or even just having good agricultural extension support for farmers wanting to grow it.
Those sound like pretty significant hurdles to overcome if its potential is to be fully realized.
They are, yes.
But you also mentioned opportunities. What's on the positive side of the ledger?
Indeed. There's definitely a growing opportunity now to properly integrate Enset into Ethiopia's national policies, climate change strategies, agricultural development plans.
Why is that important?
Because formal recognition can unlock resources, funding, and government support for more research and wider adoption.
Okay.
And increased investment in the science is vital. Developing those improved varieties, better processing methods, maybe even new value-added products from Enset, and also simply facilitating knowledge sharing, connecting communities with deep Enset experience with areas where it could potentially be adopted.
Sharing that traditional wisdom.
Exactly. And just generally, as the world gets more worried about food security under climate change, there's this growing recognition that crops like Enset, locally adapted, resilient, could be really important pieces of the puzzle.
So based on all this research, what kind of specific policy recommendations are people making? What should be done?
Several key things come up repeatedly. First, explicitly include Enset in national climate and agriculture policies, acknowledging its dual role in adaptation and mitigation.
Makes sense. Give it official standing.
Right. Second, significantly increase research funding to fill those knowledge gaps, breeding, agronomy, processing, quantifying its environmental benefits more precisely.
More science.
Yes. Third, develop really context-specific plans for expanding Enset cultivation. You can't just drop it anywhere. You need to consider local environments, local cultures.
Tailored approaches.
Exactly. Fourth, strengthen the whole value chain. That means helping develop markets for Enset products, maybe promoting new processed foods, and crucially, making sure women benefit fairly, as they are often central to processing and selling Enset.
Gender focus is important there.
Very. And finally, systematically document and share that invaluable indigenous knowledge about Enset. Don't let it get lost. and actively consider including Enset in rural development programs and extension packages, especially in drought-prone, food-insecure areas. It could be transformative.
It really sounds like there's a sort of momentum building to finally give this remarkable crop the attention it
I
deserves.
think so, yes. There's growing awareness.
So, to kind of wrap things up here, bring our discussion to a close,
Hmm.
what would you say is the single most important takeaway from this deep dive into NSET?
For me, the central, most compelling insight is just that Enset is this truly extraordinary and frankly globally underappreciated crop. It holds just immense potential for helping Ethiopia adapt to climate change and contribute to mitigation efforts. Its resilience isn't just luck. It's deeply rooted in centuries of indigenous knowledge, and it's backed up now by solid scientific evidence about its drought tolerance, its soil-building properties. It's a sustainable solution staring us in the face in
Yeah.
many ways.
And thinking back through our conversation, was there one particular detail that really struck you?
Yes. The fact that just sticks with me is that in those regions where Enset is the absolute bedrock of the food system, there have been no recorded famines.
No famines at all.
None recorded.
Hmm.
That truly positions it as this incredible field bank, like we said earlier, a living, breathing, natural safeguard against climate-driven food crises.
That's a profoundly powerful point. Really is. So as we finish up our deep dive today, what's the key question or maybe a final thought you'd want to leave our listeners mulling over?
I guess it's this. As climate change impacts really ramp up everywhere, what crucial lessons can we learn from Ethiopia's tree against hunger,
Hmm.
and maybe from other similar locally adapted resilient food systems that exist elsewhere in the world? Could these, sometimes overlooked, maybe unconventional crops and systems hold some of the keys we desperately need for broader food security, for environmental sustainability, and what's looking like a really uncertain future? It really makes you think about the power of that indigenous knowledge and the potential just sitting there in the plants and practices adapted to specific places. We shouldn't ignore it.